Hi, I'm Sharmen Kimbrough from the Marriage Recovery Center, and today I want to talk just a little bit about borderline personality disorder and just some thoughts I have about that, its connection with narcissism and with trauma and some ways to heal. So, the more I have studied psychology, the more I have dived into people's stories, the more convinced I am that every psychological disorder actually has its basis in attachment disruption somewhere. Every dysfunction seems to stem from a root of neglect, of abandonment, and abuse. This thought adds a nuance to that account in Genesis that talks about it's not good for man to be alone. By fixing alone, I think God's way of fixing that was way bigger than simply providing a companion, and that it was really about the attachment, the connection, which was designed to be permanent and open, transparent, authentic, real, all of those things it was before the fall. And then it speaks to that at the core of who we are created to be connected. And it seems like every real disorder and dysfunction comes from a broken connection and attachment somewhere. So if you've been researching to try to make sense of the disconnection, the dysfunction, the destructiveness in your relationships, you've likely started a list of diagnostic labels that seem to capture the behaviors that you see. And so very likely you've got narcissism on that list, you've got bipolar on that list, and you've probably got borderline personality disorder on that list as well. Because it is often seen in the same circles as narcissism because much of the behaviors are the same, and it is also a response to narcissistic behaviors. It's a natural response. Those behaviors are a natural response to abnormal behavior. And many of those behavioral responses are also a natural result of trauma in general, and that, again, that's where it stems from, is trauma to connection. So if you Google borderline personality disorder, you'll see like the Mayo Clinic defines it as a mental health disorder that impacts the way you think and feel about yourself and about others, causing problems functioning in everyday life. It includes self-image issues, difficulty managing emotions and behavior, and a pattern of unstable relationships. And then a more compact definition used by the ICD-9 diagnosis is that it is a disorder characterized by extreme black and white thinking and turbulent relationships. So I link all of this back to an attachment issue because of that relational piece. It's seen in the unstable or the turbulent relationships. And all of the dysfunction is triggered by what is happening in a relational level, compounded by historical experience of relational trauma, attachment disorders. It is marked by the inability to tolerate rejection or abandonment, which requires other people for it even to be an issue. There's a very strong correlation between the self-protective, which are also often self-destructive behaviors that we use to identify borderline personality disorder, and normal responses to relational trauma of abuse, neglect, abandonment, and unmet needs that leave it up to the individual to fend for or to protect themselves. Emotional abuse will elicit many of the same characteristics that we use to diagnose borderline personality disorder. Meaning, in the context of an emotionally abusive relationship, you will see those behaviors, not because that person is borderline, but because, again, those are normal responses to abnormal behavior. The trauma of being in an emotionally destructive relationship is not only the abandonment and neglect of the abuser, but that the victim is also put in a position to abandon and neglect her own sense of personhood, her own sense of self, which they have to give up to meet the demands of the abuser, right? The abuse is all about powering over another person. So in that trauma, not only are they being neglected and abandoned by the abuser, their only response to that is to abandon and neglect their self. So the constant powering over betrays and abandons the other person's sense of self and eventually leaves them numb, empty, and utterly confused, abandoning their own sense of self. The self-image issues and ensuing dysfunctional choices come from a relational frame of reference based upon a faulty, trauma-informed internal narrative that is then acted upon as if it is truth. You know, one of the things that makes us human is that we can take past experiences and extrapolate them into the future to project what to expect in the future. But the fault in that is if our experiences have been abnormal and traumatic, we're now using that to inform the future, and it leaves a lot of gaps in the reality of what could be there because now they have this trauma-informed thinking. There is dissonance between hyper-independence, you know, that sense of I can take care of myself, which is something we learn when we are abandoned and neglected, is that it is up to us. So there's that dissonance between that hyper-independence, that I can take care of myself, and desperate clinging, that desperate need for connection that leads to this thinking of no one abandons me. If anyone's going to abandon me, it's going to be me abandoning them, like that kind of thinking. There's a dissonance between a loner belief system of it's all up to me and the ability to cultivate systems and connections that truly satisfy them or are healthy. So you can't have an it's all up to me mentality and still be able to function well in healthy interdependent relationships, because there's no true freedom. There's no reciprocity, there's no mutuality in their thinking because of the trauma, because of the ways they've had to learn to protect themselves, and this means they're not extending it as an option in their relationships. So past trauma to attachment formation compounds the whole perspective because, again, every gap in understanding gets filled with suspicion and threat to their sense of self and belonging. And those behaviors are pervasive when perpetuated or triggered by continued trauma, including perceived threats. So when you're in unstable, volatile relationships, everything becomes a perceived threat, even if it may not be. But a lot of times, you know, that volatility is because there's real threats there as well. But when you have a mentality that's been impacted by trauma, everything gets looked at as a threat. There's something that has to be guarded against in that space. And this is important, an important aspect to keep that trauma piece in mind. Trauma teaches the brain to perceive everything as a threat. Even what would normally be seen as good or normal in a healthier relationship is viewed with suspicion, looking for a string attached of some sort. Because the trauma-informed person, their internal chaos is fed by a narrative of threats within the external relationships, which are then acted out in dysfunctional behavior intended to fix their fear of abandonment. So, in other words, they're looking around to go, you know, this all looks like that person is leaving me or choosing other friends or not taking care of my needs, and then they act out of that perception, often in ways that end up self-destructive, but it's meant to fix their fear of abandonment, that threat of abandonment. So this can look like making claims that they were made to do, the harmful, destructive, or coercive things they do in response to any behavior they perceive as rejection or abandonment. So examples could be deleting all of his female friends from his social media account, or harming herself so that he would have to spend his evening taking care of her. He or she doesn't accept someone else's "no, I don't want to be with you," and works hard to control the relationship to either make them stay in it or harass their other relationships to isolate them. They may also act on a belief that hurting the person they want or love will make that person come back and stay. In all of this, there is no connection that their behavior is self-destructive or sabotaging the very thing they are desperate to fix. They do not feel connected to their own life, let alone to the people around them, so they can't see how their own behavior is impacting these people in a way that pushes them away. Clearly, if healthy relationships in and of themselves could cure the attachment dysfunction, then borderline personality disorder, probably narcissism, codependency, all of those attachment disorders could be much more easily overcome. But even a good, healthy relationship cannot fill the void of another person's heart without that person doing the work to heal from their trauma and loss and attachment disorders. However, healthy relationships do provide the opportunity to have a corrective emotional experience necessary to potentially heal. Whereas staying destructive or staying engaged in a destructive relationship without boundaries makes it impossible to heal. Healing requires an ownership mindset, a sense of agency and self-efficacy within the context of strong, healthy boundaries, which also requires separation from current abuse. So if there's a current relationship that is compounding abuse, ongoing abuse, it does require separation from that. It requires learning to regulate one's own internal environment with grounded, healthy skills rather than frantic, reactive, self-destructive habits. Approaches such as DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, and other trauma therapies, they work really effectively for this. The goal is to find or build the sense of self that has been lost or abandoned or never formed, so that they are able to stand on their own emotional ground in the face of relationships, whatever those relationships are. It is also necessary to regain the ability to attach, which is necessary for a relationship. You have to have an attachment. So the goal is also to regain that ability to attach appropriately in a relationship where there is freedom, mutuality, and reciprocity. So if you think you have been plagued by a stronghold of fear of abandonment and are unable to regulate your emotions and then find yourself reacting very self-destructively, we would love to help you find your way out of that stronghold. So please contact us today through our website, marriagerecoverycenter.com, or contact our front desk. Email us at the front desk at marriagerecoverycenter.com. We would love to help untangle what is going on in your life and set you on a path to hope and healing and living life well. Thanks for your time. I hope you have a great day.